Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition of Ramble and Mosey, where we talk about critical issues in conservation and outdoor recreation. Celebrating the people and places that make Michigan special, we hope you're as inspired by these sessions as we are. None of the stories would be possible without the dedication of people and organizations working in their local communities. So while we talk big picture, just know that everything really gets done on the ground. Production for these sessions is provided by Sawyer Harris at Anamoya, thought leadership by Parallel Solutions, and of course the great support that we get from the C.S. Mott Foundation and the Conservation Fund. Hanging out with us today are two close friends, Stacy Bare, Executive Director for the Friends of Grand Rapids Parks, and Luis Benitez, the Chief Impact Officer for the Trust for Public Land. Whether you're checking in today during your commute, working out, or just escaping responsibility, get ready to laugh, learn, and reflect with us. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us.
I'm already laughing.
Mosey, huh? I'm thinking sort of like skip and sachet. Like what? Ramble and Mosey. I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah, those are the two speeds Mackenzie moves in, either a ramble or a Mosey. Mackenzie's my wife.
Jonathan said you like he's like, there's a part of this. I was wondering if you were going to mention that. Okay.
Yeah, she just doesn't move fast.
I hope she doesn't listen to this episode.
She might. While she's rambling and moseying.
Probably, yeah. God love her.
So both of you have a really rich history in the outdoor industry and conservation and your own personal lives in terms of issues you're dedicated to. For our listeners, Stacy, maybe share a little bit about where you're coming from, and Luis also. And then both of you have some unique Michigan connections, so I want to explore that a little bit as well, as how you ended up here and why here.
I have been in Michigan for 2 years and moved out here after a decade in Salt Lake City. Had been in and around the outdoor industry since I came home from Iraq in 2007 and originally found climbing through a friend, and that was a pathway to healing, a pathway to recreating my identity post-military, and that's actually how I met Luis. The first winter after I started climbing, I got invited down to an ice climbing event in Ouray, and I had the good fortune of meeting Luis, and we've been buddies ever since. But, one of the things a lot of times in Michigan, it's been interesting because some people want to know why we left Utah, right? And it's this question, and some people are like, oh, Utah's great, but no wonder you came to Michigan. And so I think there's this split personality in Michigan where people either really love and see the value of our outdoor spaces, or they think that because they're in outdoor recreation, they're supposed to be somewhere else, maybe that has a little bit more visual grandeur or higher peaks, or that elevation is the end-all be-all of recreation. But one of the things that Mackenzie and I talked a lot about is that if the mountains are calling and I must go, what happens when the mountains hung up? And I think we learned what we were supposed to learn from the mountains. It's not that I don't miss the mountains or anything else, but both Mackenzie and I had spent a lifetime coming to and from the Great Lakes. And it was the call of the Loon, it was the call of the Northwoods, it was the call of the Grand River. And, the lakes were calling, the dunes were calling. And so we followed where our passions were leading us to come to Michigan, and there was an opportunity that Friends of Grand Rapids Parks, Stephanie had just moved on to the Grand Rapids Public Schools Foundation. There was an opportunity, I applied, and we were lucky enough for that job to allow us to move to Michigan. And it's been a phenomenal experience being in Michigan. There's incredible opportunity here. There's so many amazing people, and there's just so many cool things to do. And so that's my tie back into Michigan. My mother-in-law is from Jackson, which also helped make the transition a little bit easier. And, we live in a really amazing world, and we get to live in one of the most beautiful countries with so many different places and regions that each have their own flavor of outdoor awesome. And we're just really lucky to call Michigan home.
And you mentioned the Friends of Grand Rapids Parks. For our listeners who aren't familiar, talk a little bit about the Friends. What's the story there?
Yeah, so Friends of Grand Rapids Parks is a little bit different than a normal Friends organization. A lot of times a normal Friends organization focuses just on raising funds, but we actually followed our community in 2008 when the recession happened and the Parks Department budget was slashed, and so there was no maintenance. And so the community said, well, who's going to take care of the parks? And that's what Friends was born out of. And since that time, we've developed a world-class parks and recreation system. The community has voted overwhelmingly for millages to support our parks. David Marquardt is leading a world-class program, through the Trust for Public Land scoring, which typically only looks at the top 100 metros and sizes in cities in the United States, and Grand Rapids falls outside of that. I think we're 123rd or 127th. But if we follow the Trust for Public Land scoring, we know that we're a top 15 city in parks. And so what Friends does is we work alongside the community in the city to ensure that our park habitats are restored, maintained, and improved, that our community and urban forest is growing, it's healthy, and that we're planting trees where shade ought to be, and in many cases historically hasn't been for several generations. And then we also work to connect people to the experiences of parks and the community education and outreach so that the community continues to lead on parks. So those are all the things we do on a day-to-day basis. And it's a big shift for me because I spent years doing big multi-day expeditions, traveling all over the world, but having family and wanting to make sure I experience those things with my daughter has been a massive transition. And so it's been a real learning experience to go from multi-day expeditions to 35 minutes, 45 minutes out in parks. And I think it's one of the amazing things that Trust for Public Land is also doing is saying, and so many people in the outdoor industry are finally recognizing the value of our city parks. And I sometimes wonder if the rest of the outdoor industry, some of the big brands, if there's still a disconnect, or if the way we think about ourselves as outdoor people, there's still such a big disconnect between is spending 30 minutes in a park running around with a kid, pushing a swing, sitting under a picnic table as valid an experience as climbing Mount Everest. I would argue that yes, they are, but I think there's still an esteem issue, or there's a disconnect between, well, I just went to the park, or I was talking to somebody the other day and they were like, well, I'm not really a mountain biker. And I was like, oh, you don't bike? And they're like, well, no, I ride Upper Makatawa all the time with my son. And I'm like, well, then why don't you see yourself as a mountain biker? Just because you're not at Red Bull or Hardline. And I love watching those events too, but I mean, we have some of the best flow trails in the world here in Michigan. So that's been one of the challenges, I think, is figuring out how do we get the rest of Michigan to see itself for the beauty that's here, and how do we get the rest of the world to also recognize all the different ways that you can experience the outdoors. And one of the things, like, you know, Jonathan, you and I have talked a lot about the skiing culture in Michigan, and, you know, this has been a horrible year for skiing, and yet you drive up to Cabernet on the weekend, or you head out to Cannonsburg, and if there's any snow on the middle of the hill, it's still as full as it can be. And people out here ski unironically in jeans. And it's really welcome, and it's really open. And so I think it's easy to look at with the outdoor industry and think, oh, the outdoor industry is just the brands and what people are selling. But the reality is the outdoor industry is so much more than that. And also, as much as I love the brands and have been supported by the brands over the years in my own career, like, you can get outside with a pair of $30 sneakers and, you know, 10-year-old jeans that you got from JCPenney or Target. Like, that is a valid outdoor experience. And that's one of the things I think we have to continue to both lift up our gear and apparel partners, but also lift up those folks who may or may not have the resources or even the desire to purchase that gear, but still want to have a great time outside.
Yeah, I hope we can circle back to that a little bit too, because I think that's pretty apparent in most industries, right? Where there's like the visual, there's the marketing image of what being like a correct outdoorist looks like, or the right places to go. And what so often we just really want to talk to people and be like, look, like, there's no right way to get outside. There's no right way to be an outdoorist. Like, if you love it and it makes you happy, that's the right way to do it, right?
Absolutely.
Like, it's a mutual benefit. It's not what the glossy magazine shows you. Luis and I were talking a bit earlier also about some of the events that have been either canceled or adjusted recently based on climate change and all the weather patterns and rain we're seeing in places where we weren't expecting it. And the community still sticks with it, though, right? So if you have an ice climbing festival that's rained out, that doesn't mean that the 3,000 people go home. It just means they look for a different way to celebrate the outdoors. And so I think that's really kind of the common thread for a lot of folks is like, what's close to home? What can I do? What does it mean to me? How does it create my identity? Not what's on the cover of a glossy magazine.
Well, and to that, for me, I'm having a really hard time not having the number of ski days that I want with my daughter, with my family. And I love that time. Like, some of the best times I have with my daughter are on the ski lift. But we also have to recognize that, like, to live at such a time when we could ski, and the ski industry isn't even 100 years old. Mountain biking, really, like, maybe the 70s or 80s. You could make a case maybe as far back as the late 60s for some of the mountain biking in the States. These are really new things on the global scale, and we assume that they should be absolute in perpetuity. And I think we do absolutely need to work on climate, but we also, a big part of what's happening with climate change is we have to figure out climate adaptation. And I think one of the things we don't think enough about is, well, who says? I mean, skiing, as lovely as it is, there's a lot of skiing and the way that we ski that has a huge climate impact, from whether it's cutting tree runs or how much energy goes into solving, you know, like how much energy does it take to run a ski lift. And I love those things, and that trade-off has always been okay for me. But what are the things that, Luis and I's daughters are going to invent? What sports are there? What are we going to do in the rain? Because eventually maybe ice climbing does go away or become ever more niche and finds ever smaller bits of ice. But I don't even think we know what the future of outdoor recreation looks like, because I think there's so much yet still to be discovered and still to be created for different ways in how we recreate outside.
Luis, it's fair to say that your career has spanned continents and altitudes and latitudes. What are you working on now? Where are you coming from? What's good?
Holy cow. Well, thank you for having me, Jonathan. And I could just sit here in this lovely studio with big windows and helicopters flying outside and just listen to Stacy wax poetic all day. I think to Stacy's point and somewhat to your point, there's a lot going on in the industry. And I think that momentum and trajectory has been building over the last, I would say, 10 years, over the last decade. And really what the conversation has moved to is, instead of it being this nice, fun thing that's sort of a given, you're always going to have somewhat of a green space. You're always going to be able to go outside wherever you are, wherever you live. That's sort of an American-born right. I think the conversation is now shifting to, if we are an industry at scale and of size for the United States, responsible for a significant amount of American jobs, what does that political voice look like? What are the things that we're focused on? What are the things that we're moving towards? I joined the Trust for Public Land about 10 and a half months ago to really start asking that question larger than in previous years, because I think from a policy scale and really understanding nature as infrastructure, I think that's one of the questions that we haven't gotten to yet in the United States, but are slowly starting to understand that when it comes to really defining quality of life, and to Stacy's point, what our daughters will, not only how they'll be recreating, but what some of the climate-driven conversations will be when their generation comes of age. I think we're starting to lay the groundwork for a lot of those things. And so, if you look at TPL through that lens of, they've done about 4 million acres of public lands that have been protected. They've created about, a little over 5,000 parks, trails, schoolyards, and iconic outdoor places. And we've also been focused on ballot initiatives and raising over $93 billion in public funding for parks and public lands. I think slowly but surely there are organizations out there like Stacy's, like the Trust for Public Lands, that are starting to see nature as infrastructure, to understand that this isn't a nice to have, it's a need to have. And with respect to dollars of scale, the outdoor industry in the United States represents over 1.1 trillion in consumer spending. And that's not a small piece of the economy. And so how is that economy and industry protected? How does it find and activate its voice? I think some of these questions are just now being looked at, even after a decade of momentum. And so a lot of the things that I'm working on have to do with focusing in on that space.
And Luis, Michigan for you is a love relationship.
Michigan
for sure, right?
For me, yes. As Stacy, and I think you like to say, I am a Michigander by marriage. I met a wonderful girl from Alpena, Michigan, up on Long Lake, and so a significant portion of my summer is spent up on the lake and on the trails around Long Lake. Got married on Mackinac Island too, so a lot of fudge, a lot of horse-drawn carriages. It's when my wife told me that we're going to this island that has no automated vehicles and you get around by bicycle or by horse-drawn carriage, the first thing that came to my mind, this is like any other expedition. You bring everything in by boat. You have to carry everything either by hand or by horse, by beast of burden or a bicycle. This feels a lot like moving an expedition. So as Stacy likes to remind me, my wedding weekend was 98 degrees with 110% humidity, both in and around town. But just that special, unique nature, I think it goes to show you that the partner that I chose also has a deep affinity and belief, and family that I'm now a part of has a deep affinity and belief that wild spaces and outdoor places are vital to a community's growth and development.
And would you say Katie would prefer to wear dark green or blue and gold?
Oh God, she's a Spartan. I can't. I'm not getting into that at all. Right down the road, East Lansing. Go Spartans.
Well, we're happy to claim you as one of our own, which we do. So
fair enough.
Stacy, Luis mentioned Long Lake, in his time there. What are your favorite spots? What since you've been in Michigan, what do you like?
Yeah, so much opportunity here in Michigan. My favorite local park, I love Richmond Park. There's a great little downhill bike scene there, just an amazing community there. There's the sled hill. There's great little hikes there, the pool, the pond. We spent a lot of time at Richmond. And then as we start heading out from Richmond Park, I love heading to the lakeshore. Saugatuck is one of my favorite state parks. Hoffmaster is just a wonderful park. So the dune ecosystem and spending time at Lake Michigan and on Lake Michigan is one of my absolute favorite things to do. But when I first moved out here, we checked out Cape Tawas. And I think what's so neat about Michigan is each of the lakes have such a unique personality. And obviously Lake Superior, everybody loves Lake Superior for a reason. It's just so big. It's so wild. But on the day-to-day, you can probably find me at Richmond Park, biking one of the local trails out in Kent County, or on the lakeshore.
Nice, right on. So we have this question we like to ask everyone, which has no right answer, and just that, no right answer. People often talk about what their professional resume is, which is what I did to both of you, right? Like, who are you? What do you do? But if someone came up to you on the street and asked you what your outdoor identity is, Luis, how might you answer that? What's your outdoor identity?
Ooh, boy, ironically enough, Stacy, you and I have had a lot of conversations about this. To your point in your introduction, I've been lucky enough to wear a lot of hats in the outdoor industry, and I like to joke with folks that that's pretty much it. I'm a one-trick pony. Most of my career has been spent wearing different hats within the industry, from public sector to private sector, to even a couple of rounds in academia. And I think being identified as the mountaineer, the high-altitude mountaineer professional athlete for a really long time, guiding the 7 summits, working for an international company, that's still very much a large part of my identity. It's something that I still identify with, but I do distinctly remember the transition time in my life when that wasn't what was led with when I walked into a room. It was, this is Luis, fill in the blank. Everest was never mentioned. The Himalayas was never mentioned. And as that identity evolved, and especially as I got married and have had kids, I really see my identity as an outdoor dad. It's a new role for me, but it's something, to Stacy's point, a lot of the joy I get right now are skiing greens with my daughter, going stand-up paddleboarding and, exploring, creeks and woods and smaller scale adventures that to her are absolutely everything and expands her aperture. So I would say my identity has taken on a lot of shapes and sizes over the years. But without a doubt, now I am 110% an outdoor dad.
Nice.
Well, I was going to say mountain biker, but I feel like guilted into saying outdoor dad too. But I do think, definitely
that's mine.
An outdoor dad.
But and what else?
Me too.
Yeah. Outdoor dad. And Jonathan's the outdoor uncle for all of our
that's fair
kids running around. I came to the outdoors as I grew up doing a lot of outdoorsy things, but I didn't really find my outdoor identity until I was in my early 30s. And at first I was a climber, and then I was a skier, and then I was a mountaineer. And, but over the years, different things have brought me to different experiences. And I'd say outside of outdoor dad, I love being on a bike. And, the pandemic was a lot of things to a lot of people. And I didn't love going from running my own company and, big corporate speaking, and all of a sudden I found myself driving a forklift. But I drove a forklift at a bike company, and I met just amazing people, and I got a bike. And I hadn't been on a bike in any serious way for more than a decade, 20 plus years for mountain biking. And now, that's what I think about and dream about is, where can I ride next? What can I do? I still love skiing and anything in a river, whether it's a flat river or a wild river. So those would be and more and more I get to take my daughter with me. And that has been so much fun, whether it's been on a bike, on a raft, or on the skis. And that just, that makes a world of difference.
Let's, if you guys don't mind, let's shift gears a little bit from sort of individual scale to national big picture scale. Lots of conversation over the last 5 years, 10 years, in particular about the impact of the outdoors economically, as well as the health benefits. And I think those two are worth diving into for sure individually as topics, but then for different reasons, but also allied reasons. So we can kind of mess up the puzzle pieces and then put them back together a little bit. A few years back, the Bureau of Economic Analysis started to capture what the impact of the outdoor industry was across the country. Previously, those numbers had been calculated by trade associations, which gave us a good picture of what we were looking at. But like all things, if those numbers are coming from internal, they're sometimes met with a little bit of suspect rather than having an independent source doing it. So having BEA, or the Bureau of Economic Analysis, start to compile those numbers for us, I think has been very impactful, both on a fundraising perspective, on an economic impact perspective, on a policy perspective, and so on. Luis, fair to say that the creation and the movement of recognizing the OREC industry across the country owes a great debt of gratitude to you. Wondering if you might reflect a little bit on the path that we took to get maybe the last 5 years, 10 years, how we got to where we are now. And then what are you seeing? What's in your crystal ball for where the industry is headed?
Oh, you see the gray in my beard, right? And Stacy just made a wisecrack about my hair thinning out about 20 minutes ago, too. So it's...
Tell us what it was like following Utah in outdoor rec.
That's cold, man.
You were the first, second place.
He's all, hysterical hazing aside.
Hey, you're shout out to Brad, right?
You're right.
The original Brad in the outdoor industry.
You're right. Yeah. And I think it really came down to a friendly grudge match between governors was how it started. Then Governor Herbert in Utah, and then now Senator Hickenlooper in Colorado. Governor Herbert in Utah recognized early on that this was something that needed to be paid attention to through an economic lens, that it was a significant portion of Utah's economy. And so he started the first outdoor industry office. And to Stacy's point, all credit to the godfather, Brad, who was the first director out of all of us. Yeah, Brad Peterson. And then Governor Hickenlooper couldn't stand for it. So that's when he pulled me out of Eagle, Colorado, where I was happily living away in a quiet 7,500 person community, and asked me if I'd like to be the first director. And that experiment burgeoned into now 20 states with an outdoor industry office, including Michigan, your director, Brad Garman. And that coalition of directors now represents what's called the confluence of states. And the confluence of states really was an idea around, if you have all these offices beholden to all of their governors, what are the rules of the road for all the offices? Is there a way that you could codify and galvanize all these states, red, blue, or purple, didn't matter the political stripe, and really understand that when you're talking about the good of all for the industry, what are the lenses that you want to look through? And what we landed on with the Confluence Accords was economic development, conservation and stewardship, education and workforce development, and public health. And so the states that have agreed to those accords are signatories with the blessing of their governor. And that's basically saying, we agree to these operating principles. We agree that the offices will focus in these 4 places, and this is what we're doing. Now, with the density of 20 states now that have offices, a very real conversation has started with the Department of Commerce to if we should create a federal office of outdoor recreation industry. And really, it's on the back of what you describe with commerce counting us towards a GDP. When you have an economy of that size in the United States, you really are talking about national security. You're talking about protecting an economy that relies on the preservation and stewardship of natural resources. So it really does connect to, I think, the best of what America represents, and that representation needs to be proportional to the size of our economy.
Are there, based on your travels and all the work that you do, are there other countries globally that have taken as much intentional action and intent to look at the impact of the outdoors, the impact of the industry? In some countries, I know it's more woven into their culture more directly than it is ours, based on mountain landscapes or seaside fjords, things like that. Are there other places that you think have done it well that we should emulate, or are we really are we breaking path?
I think wild spaces all the way back to the Roosevelt administration have really been codified as America's best idea. Outdoor wild spaces and the amount of land that we have dedicated to the promotion of and the engagement through the outdoors is really unique to the American story. And, when you look at other countries and what they do and the pieces that they have, I think the opportunity that we have in the American landscape is connecting some of those dots. So we were joking earlier today about all the Scandinavian countries. I think there is now, last count, I think 17 that can actually, the doctors in those countries can actually prescribe time outside the same way they can prescribe a course of medication. So they are deeply ingrained in the conversation around public health and what the time outside means. And that conversation has started to grow in the United States through the veteran community, who have true hard case evidence that time outside can impact the severity of traumatic brain injuries as well as PTSD. So they're not just doing it because it's a nice thing to suggest. They're actually they have quantifiable data that proves that there's an impact there. I think another piece that we're starting to see this evolve and emerge in the United States, so to answer your question, it's happening in pieces, is how higher ed is starting to engage in this conversation. You're starting to see universities across the country that are creating not outdoor industry programs to create the next generation of mountain guide or river guide or mountain biking guide, but true leadership, economic leadership for this economy and for this industry, and really understanding what that looks like. And then, with respect to how other countries are getting it together and what they're proposing, the most recent one that was a real eye-opener was, fun fact about Chile, for all their other political drama that they're having right now, they're actually engaged in their own constitutional convention. They're rewriting their constitution for, I mean, this is not a new process for them, but the difference now compared to others is they're considering codifying the outdoors as infrastructure within their constitution.
Oh, wow.
Recognizing for a fact that there needs to be protections at scale in Chile. When you think of all the iconic things that are in Chile, from Patagonia all the way down south, all the way up north to where the vineyards are, how that impacts economic development, what happens with mining in certain parts of the country as well. They're now recognizing that without a constitutionally based protection of natural resources, that there's just not a strong enough ecosystem to do what needs to be done. So that I would point to as the most recent example of something outside the United States where these things are possible. And I think the uniqueness of the American innovation, the decidedly innovative American spirit, if you will, is the fact that we can stitch together all these things to figure out how to do it in our own unique way.
Well, if you think about that too, right? New Zealand has granted personhood to rivers and mountains. Mm-hmm. And I think that harkens back to a lot of, indigenous conversations and indigenous rights and indigenous interpretations of the world we live in. And I think, if you talk to people who spend time outside, whatever it is, right? Hunting, if you're fishing, if you're boating, so many people have the conversations anyway, whether they're tongue in cheek or real, with the lakes, with the trees around them, right? I mean, we talk about praying for snow. We talk about, praying for the buck to show up. We talk about what the weather is like or how the forest felt, and we also know that, right? Like, we can see with houseplants, right, that plants interact with us when we come in, that plants respond to angry voices, that plants respond to kind voices. And the science and the data is there to back that up. So if you take that to a much larger scale, we're talking with other beings in this very, very real way, right? And many of us have had relationship with a certain fish, with a deer, with a buck that we just couldn't get, with a buck that we saw season over season over season and never found an opportunity. And then you get to the point where you finally had that clean shot. My brother has this story, and he said, I saw the same damn buck year after year in the deer stand on Dad's old farm down in West Virginia. And then finally I had a clear shot after 3 or 4 years, and I just couldn't take it. And so we have these conversations, and of course they're going to be healing. We know that connection is necessary. We know that engagement is necessary. We know that we're the loneliest we've ever been as a country. And so, of course, time outdoors is going to be healthy. And I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Dacher Keltner to look at that first research where we saw the emotion of awe as that critical ingredient. And now one of the researchers that was on that, Craig, is doing a show that just got, there's a show out on HBO or ESPN or Disney or something like that around a group of veterans out in the Arctic. And what does that look like, healing and awe? And that's really awesome. But you don't have to go to the Arctic for those things. You don't have to go to Everest for those things. And that's not to disparage people who do either. I've had the opportunity to have...
Take it easy.
Right. I've had the opportunity to do some of those big, I got to ski the tallest mountain in Iraq. It wasn't Everest, but I got to be the first recorded group to be able to go do that. And that's amazing, but you can have an amazing time. The stand of cedars in our backyard is my daughter's favorite place in the world. It's her forest. It's where, or hop on the fence to get into the pond that's right there, the storm drainage ditch. And so, I mean, there are all these places where nature matters so much, and the research just keeps piling on. But even if you look at ancient scriptures, right, New Testament, Old Testament, it's all about where do people encounter God? They encounter God outside. And so it's there, But for some reason, over the last 100 years, part of us have moved so far away from it. And I think you saw during the pandemic, people wanted to connect with each other. They wanted to reconnect with nature. And even in my own life, like, definitely as a veteran, being part of that story, seeing these ecstatic experiences, the awe-inspiring experiences, you meet people you wouldn't otherwise meet. You have deep connections with folks, and then you move on along the trail. And my dad now is in full memory care. He has no idea who I am. Several months ago, he actually said on the phone, he was like, well, I know I have a second son, but I'd never give a boy a girl's name, so it's definitely not you. But one of the things, even in that, when he didn't remember who I was, he could tell me stories about fishing with his second son. And those were the last memories that my dad held on to, were the memories of fish, were the memories of pulling up brookies and rainbows, were the memories of hooking onto halibut in Alaska on a trip with his boys. And that is what the outdoors gives us, is these stories and these lifelines. And when I think about climate and the shift, it's less about missing skiing and more about missing the opportunity to deeply connect with my daughter. It's less about the survival of a trout species. And we know in Michigan, as the streams are, Trout Unlimited is born here, and as the streams are heating up, what are the trout going to do? And that's bad. And I'm worried about that ecosystem. But I'm also worried about sons and daughters and fathers and mothers and friends, and how are we going to connect? And just, again, like, just watching my dad still be able to tell you every story in minute detail about a fish from the Green River. And that's it. That was all that was left of him. And where do we go if we're not prioritizing that? Like, what are we doing as a species, as humanity, if we're not doing that? And you can look at it too, and like the state of Texas, 76% of voters passed $1 billion funding bill for state parks. So it's not a political issue. And yet we need political will and funding and private funding and government funding to make this happen. It's the health of our country.
I think you touched on a lot of really important parts there, and I want to break down a couple of them if we can. Now, for those that aren't familiar, Michigan actually has more public land than any other state east of the Mississippi. And that became really prominent during COVID in particular, where in a lot of the western states, for example, where there's large tracts of federal public land, they were closed, they were shut down. Whereas in Michigan, a lot of our public lands, because they were state-owned lands, remained open. And so what we saw was really like this infrastructure piece. I mean, the nerds like me talk about it as infrastructure, right? Like, we have all this great infrastructure. What we really had was a lot of awe. We had a lot of easy opportunities for awe, a lot of easy opportunities for healing. Those pieces you talked about, with both of your daughters, but then with our families as well, how easily and quickly the outdoors nature imprints on us. I think the only thing, if I remember right from some of my readings, art is the only other thing. Art and music are the only other things that even come close to imprinting on our brains the same way that the outdoors does.
Right.
But yet we so much take it for granted, where then it becomes just that. We start to talk about it like infrastructure and a commodity, which, that puts it in the terms that politicians and developers and others can understand, but it also takes that human element away from it. It makes it's the outside, it's a something else, it's someplace else we go, versus being part of our ongoing in our daily life. But I really like that piece you highlighted early on, right? That awe is the secret ingredient. And awe can be present in daily lives and in simple ways. It doesn't just have to be at the top of a mountain. It can be at your local park. It can be at your local nature preserve. It can be volunteering with a stewardship crew. That sense of awe comes about in so many different ways, not just big experiences.
Right. And that's why we do so much work here at tree planting, because that's going to be a lot of people's first experience in nature, is what they see when they walk out the door. And there's something, I almost wonder if it's trained out of us, right? The joy of recess and running around and finding a couple of trees and what happens in a magical grove. And then all of a sudden we're like, is this no longer good enough? And again, like, different people are going to find joy in different landscapes. And I think we got to really celebrate that, as opposed to shying away from that. I think there is times where we need to really, really push into and celebrate our differences. I mean, we were talking about last night. I mean, Luis and I have been close for years, and now we're on slightly different paths of outdoor journeys. I mean, we can find ourselves again on the river, but not as interested in screaming downhill on a mountain bike, and I'm not as interested in counting calories and figuring out how many spoonfuls of protein powder I can take up to the top of a mountain.
I want to be very clear. Luis said no to the mountain. Definite hard no to the mountain bike. It wasn't doesn't want to. It was you're on your own.
No, like I'm going to be broken in a tree somewhere. That's
right. And I look forward to being broken in a tree because anybody who has any spent time with me, I will always fall. I will fall off a paddleboard. I will fall off a cliff. I will fall off my mountain bike. I simply cannot do the outdoors without falling at least once.
What'd you say to me when the first time I saw you hit a tree? You're like, your face, like you looked as if you expected me to be really hurt, but no, I'm good.
Good.
The tree might not be, but I'm good.
The tree might not make it. Yeah. So no, but I mean, and I think
just describe to the listeners your physicality too. Like we're not talking about a petite, small little wildflower. You were 6'7", shaved head, bearded.
I'm a large human.
You're a large human.
I'm a large human, and most outdoor gear
most
does
trees
not fit me.
should be scared of you.
That's right.
Let's just be clear.
But and that is the thing is like that's why planting trees are so important. That's why your city parks are so important. That's why finding that wild space and you know the wilderness. There's a legislated wilderness, and then there's the wilderness inside of us. And I think connecting to that and finding ways to connect to that on a daily basis are so critically important. I think sometimes we do oversell the value of awe. And I think sometimes if we don't have like a mind-blowing experience every time, we're like, oh, you know, was it a good enough trip? And sometimes there are going to be times where you're going to go out and it's a slog. The mountain bike is a slog. The climb is a slog. The paddle is a slog. But I'm still glad I go out there because there is almost always something you find. And even if you fish all day long and you don't get a single fish and you can't even, you know, the tug is the drug, but you're still in a beautiful spot.
That's on a hat somewhere for sure.
I have no idea.
You don't fly fish? The tug is the drug,
yes,
man.
I know exactly what you're talking about. Never quite heard it phrased like that, but that's coming from an American grandfather who had a sporting goods store, a fly fishing shop. Never. That's good. I like that.
It wasn't.
No, my grandfather
Benitez
never.
Fly fishing. The tug is the drug.
No, never said that. You know, the one part I'd like to add to this, and I think it's important. You know, I think about it in the context of cradle to grave, right? If we get American youth, regardless of location, urban or rural, to understand that you need time outside, it is a fundamental piece of growth and development. Then that kid, whatever they grow up to do, wherever they go in life, if you really work hard at making sure that the access to that first experience is equitable, and it doesn't need to be structured, to your point. It can be just unstructured, wild play. And wild doesn't need to mean the deep, dark recesses of a national forest. It can be in an urban corridor. You know, I think where we're going with AI, where we're going with technology, that is a foregone conclusion for how global business is done and sort of speed of markets. But when you think about the 100 million people today, including roughly, according to our numbers, about 28 million kids that don't have a park within a 10-minute walk of home, you have to start looking at that fundamental first entry point, first touch point with the outdoors and what we're trying to build into as an ethos for the next generation and start to understand. You know, in this podcast, Jonathan, we've talked about $1.1 trillion. We've talked about awe. We've talked about all these things that at a very fundamental level impact the way societies and economies move, yet we're still begging for political will and power. And that to me is, it's moved past unacceptable and now it's bordering on embarrassing. When you compare us to the auto industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the agricultural industry, when you think about which by the way, economies that we are on par with, we are at scale of, and you think about their political voice and political power, we have to get this equation right. So offering that entry touch point for every kid in the United States becomes a matter of course, not something that we have to request and find funding for.
Absolutely. And you almost wonder, like what are we worried about? Like everybody experiences the outdoors differently, sure. But there's so much similarity between the hunter, the fisher, the climber, the biker. We're all looking for access. We're all looking for space. And we're all looking for ways to do these things that create generational community and conversations. And yet when it comes to demanding action from our political partners in all this, we're all too often far too silent. The Explore Act is a bipartisan bill. It's about supporting people in the outdoors. It's about veteran health, and it can't get heard in Congress. Why is that? And where are the brands? Where are the people demanding that this gets heard? And again, it's bipartisan. It doesn't matter where you go. I've had some of the craziest political conversations across the political spectrum in the most loving, kind, respectful ways with people that I've met out on the trail, because the first point of connection isn't that political conversation. It's the beauty that we're seeing and witnessing. And that creates a sense of trust and openness in one another, where we can actually learn to have conversations and agree to disagree in a respectful, loving manner. And that's the point. So if there is some great conspiracy out there, I think it's to keep us inside. Like if we can't figure out how to get outside together, that's it for America. But the more time we spend outdoors, the more time we spend together, the more we can see and value other viewpoints and figure out a way forward. And that's, you got to paddle the boat together.
You move to Michigan and you start with conspiracy theories. Is that what happens? Is this part of your Michigan experience?
Start. I think he moved with the conspiracy.
I moved
theories.
with. Yeah, I'm just saying, if there is one, it's to keep people inside.
Yeah.
And look, there's cool things that happen inside too, but outside is where people's lives are truly, truly impacted, and that's where we need to go.
So, what I think is always kind of stupefying to me, quite honestly, is how quiet, to your point, how quiet our voices are sometimes, when yet a lot of outdoor activities and a lot of nature preservation and a lot of outdoor recreation is really actually focused around like how many points or how big the fish was or how many, did you see how big the buck was that I got, or I skied X number of feet, or like there's always like sort of this measure of like how awesome this was, right? Like trying to like quantify the experience that we've had. And then to Luis's point, it comes down to the politics and the policy, and then suddenly we get fairly quiet. Use your outdoor voice becomes a marketing slogan versus the actual action that someone takes. Heart of the Lakes does that too. When our slogan is "Speak loudly for the places you love." It's not meant to be a cool saying on a hat. It's actually meant to be that call to action. And for whatever reason, when it comes up to that, to like the literal stand up part of it, we start to sit down. And it's not conspiracy so much as I haven't figured out exactly why. Like the hunt fish community in Michigan will tell you, which rightfully so, that for years that they've been the source of funding for outdoor recreation and for conservation in Michigan. No qualms there whatsoever. It's been a very powerful voice. But what we've watched happen over the years is the numbers no longer equate to the volume of the voice. And that's true in quiet water sports. It's true in non-consumptive sports. It's true in bird watching. Audubon's my favorite, actually, where they encourage bird watchers and others to leave their card on the table at a cafe. So after they go through a big bird count, they want people to know that all birds count, and so do the economic resources that I've spent here. But we do that in a really quiet, almost passive way, where it's like, I was here versus that loud, I'm here, I want to support this thing.
Well, so let's talk about that for a second, because I think that's important for your listeners to understand, because I think this is, I make tongue-in-cheek jokes about the NGO infrastructure in the industry. We're holding bake sales to protect forests at this point. And you mentioned the hunting and fishing industry, which ironically enough is where I come from. My American grandfather owned a sporting goods store. It was a family-run business with him and my grandmother. I grew up in that shop. I understand what small family-owned specialty retail is like, and it's a hard business. Yet, for the Dingle Act and for other pieces of legislation that brought 18% excise taxes on everything to do with hunting and fishing, that did go back into conservation and stewardship efforts, that did carry the water for a really long time, when the rest of the industry started to come of age and the question about excise taxes for other segments of the industry started to get raised, the answer was, no, we're not big enough. We're too small. We can't support an excise tax, and what would it go to? And it'd be really confusing. When those pieces of legislation came up for hunting and fishing, they were not the most popular people in the room. It was not a good idea. Very few people, other than folks within the ecosystem that agreed to it, went for it. Yet they did carry the water for a really long time, and now you're at a place where, there's a trade association whose governing charter was built to fight excise taxes. And yet when now we're being counted from the Department of Commerce as a $1 trillion economy, but we can't pay for the ecosystems and the infrastructures that economy is built upon. I think at some point you have to acknowledge the disconnect between, are we really going to rely on nonprofits to protect a natural resource that drives $1 trillion economy? Because that's ultimately the question that we're asking right now. And I have to say the political will is now starting to shift to really understand that if you want to wait for a government handout to figure out how to pay for some of these things, grants are great. They're important. They're what drive this process forward. And we also have to understand how to take care of ourselves. I think that's going to be a really important part of the self-governing piece for our industry and for our economy.
Well, don't you think at this point, too, if you are willing to spend $500 for a tent or $5,000 for a full suspension mountain bike, that user is going to be...
Well, that's the existential conversation.
But that's my point. Are they going to be, if not happy, at least excited to know that with this purchase,
yes,
I'm also supporting the trails that I want. I'm supporting the campsites I want. I think at this point, and then we say things, right, like, well, then you're decreasing accessibility. Well, decreasing accessibility is not a $500 tent. Figure out a tent that comes in at a price point, and sure, maybe there's some reliability issues in the long term. Maybe there's some design issues that are going to be different. But most people, buy, like in biking, most people are overbiked. Most people are probably over tented. Do they need the 4-season tent that is going to withstand 348 miles on Mount Everest? Probably not if they're going to the state park on a routine basis. But that's great because we need those aspirations, right? Like that's also a really important part about it. And it's one of the things I think in Michigan that we oftentimes forget, because we think about the aspirational skiing or biking or climbing that happens where you live now, out in Colorado. We can have that here. We just haven't built the infrastructure to do that. We haven't built that Black Diamond experience. And just like most people aren't, 20% of people ski a Black Diamond run on a ski hill, but it's the access to and the idea that you could, that aspirational access that I think drives so much of our engagement, right? And those are the films that we like to watch. Those are the hero stories we like to see. And so that's where I think, to your point, if we're going to be a grown-up industry, let's act like grown-ups. And if you're selling a $500 tent, putting an excise tax on that supports campsites, that should be celebrated.
Yeah, and the conversation is no longer defensible. So let's run that conversation to ground. I buy a $4,000 shotgun, I pay 18%. You buy a $4,000 mountain bike, you pay nothing.
And I think that's what has driven a wedge that shouldn't exist between a lot of the hunting and fishing crew and the rest of the outdoor community. And that's why 100%. When you walk into these big, huge outdoor stores, what do they say? They say, we support real conservation. And that's a dig at those of us who spend our time with a bike and a backpack as opposed to a shotgun and a fishing reel. And if we want to come together around that, and again, get back away from whatever crazy partisan bullshit, then we have got to be willing to pay for our outdoor spaces. And I think most consumers in the outdoor space would be willing to do that. And yes, there's still going to be a need to provide gear libraries and lending libraries and connect people to the outdoors. I wish there wasn't. And I know TPL is working hard to create greener schoolyards and outdoor schoolyards. But I appreciate that you said that, because that has been the third rail in the conversation for so long, and we have to engage around our willingness to pay, and that's how we speak. If we're a $1 trillion industry, but we provide very minimal tax that supports the industry we love, like we're going to lose our spaces.
Yeah, and I mean, I think both of you have heard me talk about this before. I think of the archetype of us as an industry, if we could morph into an actual person, we are a pre-20-something-year-old with a massive trust fund that has access to all the secret spaces across the United States to ski and bike and run and climb. We know we've got a lot of money, but we don't really have a voice yet. We love hanging out and being cool and doing cool stuff. And there are parts of our family that are a little bit more vocal than others. But when it comes to really understanding our power and our voice, we're still in our early 20s. I think we're maturing rapidly. But I think to really understand the gravity of responsibility for what's in front of us, these are the things that are going to be part of the next conversation.
So, Luis, I want to talk a little bit about your book before we close today. But before we get there, I think one of the key threads that we should actually spend a whole another hour or two talking about is what we just started to dig into, which is the equity issue. So many times when I'm talking with my colleagues across the country, We struggle using what are the right terms: urban, rural, suburban. And the caveat oftentimes elsewhere in the country is, well, urban's not a description of black and white. And what I often have to remind my colleagues of is that in Michigan, because of the influx, southern migration in the 40s, the auto industry, the way our communities were often built around rivers, is that many of our communities, when we talk about urban versus suburban, it is actually a black-white conversation. And so money moved to the suburbs. Those that couldn't afford to stayed. And along with them, then, in some cases, our park systems and others moved with those with means. So hear both of you loud and clear in terms of standing up, paying for, and supporting the purchases that we make and the places we go to. I think sort of be delinquent if I didn't ask the question, what if I can't? What if I physically can't afford to? Does that leave me out of the conversation? Does that mean these places aren't for me? Does that mean that the tent isn't for me? How do we start? We're not going to solve it immediately, but how do we start to bridge that gap between I don't know, this looks interesting and I might want to try it, but my wallet will never allow me to get there. Where do we start?
Yeah, I mean, from my side, there are pieces of this conversation that I think we're over analyzing a little bit, and I say that knowing full and coming from my last round in the gear industry, the apparel and footwear industry part of our economy. These things are a barrier to entry. To buy the expensive puffy jacket, to Stacy's point, the expensive tent. But there's a reason why Walmart has created their own mountain biking line and their own tent line and their own clothing line for the outdoors. They recognize, I mean, I don't know about you, but I got my first pup tent from an Army Navy surplus store. There are ways to understand the gear question. And I think there are ways to, when you talk about equitable access to that stuff, if you're passionate about that, the good news is the tent that's at Walmart compared to the absolute piece of junk that I got, the canvas A-frame, that's come a long way. So I think there's a way to figure that out. With respect to the access to green space, you know, we think about this pathway from an urban community to a rural community to large landscape engagement that I think it needs to start closer to home. I don't think you need to go that big that fast. So when Stacy, you know, the work that Stacy does here in Grand Rapids, when you talk about heat sinks, and I've heard Stacy, you know, I want to hear this statistic again, throw out the heat sink statistic.
Yeah, there's an 18-degree temperature difference on the hottest day in Grand Rapids between the most shaded and the least shaded neighborhood.
I mean, you want to talk about creating awe? You want to talk about helping people understand at a very visceral level, regardless of your race, color, or creed, what it means to understand the importance of nature? Park it under a tree that's 18 degrees cooler than out on the pavement in front of your building. That's a very real tactile lesson that you can't buy, you can't create, you can't fabricate. And so I think to understand how to make green space more accessible closer to home. You know, I was a wheezy asthmatic kid with a ton of allergies, couldn't go outside a lot, and as far as I could go was to Queenie Park, which was a quarter mile away from my house. And I'd get wheezy and I'd need my inhaler and I'd have to run home again. But that I still have.
Well, you wouldn't run home.
I'd run, but I'd wheeze. I'd be wheezy. You know, it's one of those things that I have visceral memories of that park. Every time I go home, I wander into that park. I take my daughter to that park now. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, you have to understand that you create these experiences with very little need for large landscapes for that introduction. It can be small, it can be right in your backyard.
And there are a lot of people working to change that equation anyway. There's a lot of great programs that, you know, a lot of universities and community colleges have wonderful outdoor programs that are open to the community around them. Thrive Outside, which was an initiative from the Outdoor Industry Foundation, and Grand Rapids Outside definitely benefited from that. There's a gear library here run by a Parks and Rec department. They'll tell you how to use the equipment. You can get that expensive puffy jacket and use it for the weekend that you need it, and then drop it back off. There's canoes, there's kayaks, there's snowshoes, there's skis, there's pickleball equipment, there's all sorts of, there's skateboards available. There's all sorts of ways, and a lot more cities have that. And then you also in Michigan, you have a great brand like Carhartt, which isn't first and foremost an outdoor brand, but I mean, every time I went on the river, every guide, everybody out there who's been on the river more than once is wearing a pair of Carhartts or Dickies or outdoor gear like that. And that's denim. Cotton doesn't always kill. Most of the times you'll be 100% fine. 90% of the time you'll be 100% okay wearing cotton. And so you have brands like Carhartt who are pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into outdoor infrastructure and getting people outside. So there are issues, there are challenges, but like Luis said, we also have to recognize that a valid outdoor experience doesn't require expensive gear and there are bikes. I mean, Walmart's got a really great mountain bike at a really good deal. And in the same way that all other industries grow up and have this, and there's different price points and there's different points of engagement. So I think you're right. And I do think there's other ways we can address it around public transit, trail building initiatives. I mean, that's one of the things we're working on here is to make sure that 90% of our population, love to get to 100% of our population, can be 10 blocks or more, no more than 10 blocks from a natural surface trail. And that's within reach.
Wow.
He's speechless. I can't believe it.
Pretty much.
That's pretty good.
Well, so I mean, I think part of the challenge and the opportunity is what we've talked about today is like there's so much to unpack in an ongoing basis. Supposing there were a book that started to highlight some of these issues.
Just suppose.
And just supposing that book were called Higher Ground.
Just suppose.
What would that look like?
Well, I'm so glad you asked, Jonathan. Yeah, you know, the book for me was really a COVID project, frankly. You know, really starting to think about a lot of the things we're talking about today on a deeper level. It's a love letter to an industry that I grew up in, as much as it is really trying to start to define our emerging political voice, what it looks like, where we need to focus through my lens, where I think we should focus, what we should pay attention to. And, you know, what is leadership, political leadership, going to look like for this industry moving into what's next? And the exciting part for me about bringing this book to life is we're already seeing the manifestation for a lot of it. You've got Caroline Gleich, who is, you know, running for Mitt Romney's seat, who has run for Mitt Romney's seat. You've got other people that are running for local government positions all across the country that come from and are born of the industry. I think we're starting to get there. And so for me, the book is really about that, how we have folks who are from us, are us, that think the way that we do deeply and care deeply about these questions, that are starting to step up and recognize that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
So we'll make sure to put links in the show notes for sure. Direct access to Higher Ground, Luis's book. Stacy, if folks want to learn more about Friends of Grand Rapids Parks, what's the best place to do that?
Friends at grparks.org. We have a lot of opportunities for volunteering, a lot of opportunities for engaging. We do some of the best tree planting and have the most fun tree planting, invasive species control, habitat restoration anywhere in the world. And we even have people fly in to our tree plantings because they've had so much fun. Maybe they've moved away, they've heard about tree planting. We met one individual who wants to plant a tree in every state, and he stopped because he just keeps coming back to Grand Rapids and having fun with us. So we welcome people out to the parks. There's a lot of Explore Your Park events throughout the year as well. So come get outside with us and have a conversation. Tell us what you're thinking. Tell us what you need. Tell us how we can make a park better.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. I mean, this has been a fabulous conversation, outstanding. And again, one actually I'm hoping that we can kind of continue and unpack in some future episodes. Thanks so much. Again, Ramble and Mosey with sponsorship by the C.S. Mott Foundation and the Conservation Fund. Big thanks to Anamoya Studios and Parallel Solutions. And obviously, huge thanks to Stacy and Luis for joining us today. Thanks, guys.
And a big thanks to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.